My name is Julian Vance. To the world of commercial equity, I am a senior acquisition strategist for a firm that moves $80 million in distressed assets every quarter. I live in a world of variables and risk mitigation, where every square foot is measured by its yield. My office sits 40 floors above the city, a space defined by the clinical hum of a premium air filtration system and the biting, acidic scent of a strong espresso. The surface of my glass desk is always 4 degrees cooler than the room, a tactile reminder of the distance I have placed between myself and the world below. This morning, that distance vanished. My phone sat beside my tablet, lighting up with the ghost of a life I buried a decade ago. 29 missed calls from an area code in rural Illinois, a number I had not seen since the night I slept on a bus station bench with $40 and a duffel bag of wet clothes. I did not listen to the voicemails. I did not need to. I was currently reviewing the notice to quit register, a digital ledger of tenants 3 months delinquent across our residential holdings. On page 4, under a property we acquired through a silent foreclosure in March, a name stopped my heart. Eleanor Vance. My mother, the woman who once stood in a warm entryway and laughed while telling me that the real world did not owe me a place to sleep. She called her cruelty a lesson in independence. She told me I would be in the gutter by Monday. Now, 10 years later, the math has finally caught up to her. The person who mocked my survival is facing homelessness on a property I own. I know it now. Section 2. The origin of the lesson. Willow Creek was a town built on the quiet, suffocating gravity of reputation. My mother, Eleanor, understood this gravity better than anyone. She was the proprietor of Eleanor's Fine Linens, a boutique that served as the aesthetic heart of our historic district. To the neighbors, she was a woman of impeccable poise and staggering charity. They saw the way she meticulously arranged the window displays, her movements fluid and practiced, always ending with that sharp, high-pitched laugh that signaled she was open for business. The shop always smelled of dried lavender and expensive, triple-milled soap, a scent that clung to her clothes like a second, more acceptable skin. When the local charity board needed a volunteer or the garden club required a host, Eleanor was the first to step forward, her smile as fixed and reliable as a lighthouse beam. She was a pillar, a constant, a woman who spoke in gentle cadences about the importance of tradition and the sanctity of the family unit. But the scent of lavender did not follow us across the threshold of our home. The moment the heavy oak front door slid into its frame and the deadbolt clicked with that familiar, metallic finality, the mask did not drop. It simply tightened. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a clinical, predatory observation. To Eleanor, I was not a son to be nurtured, but a project to be hardened. She called it her pedagogy of resilience. In the Vance household, there were no soft edges. The furniture was mahogany and stiff, polished to a mirror finish that reflected only the absence of comfort. My childhood was a series of psychological stress tests designed to ensure I would never be soft, because Eleanor viewed softness as a personal failure of her brand. One particular afternoon remains etched into my memory with the clarity of a burn. I was 9 years old. We were at the regional mall, a place teeming with the chaotic energy of families enjoying a Saturday out. Eleanor stopped near the central fountain, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon sugar from the pretzel stand and the humid spray of recirculated water. She looked down at me, her face a masterpiece of calm indifference. She handed me a $5 bill and told me she had forgotten a specific item in a department store on the other side of the complex. Then, she told me to find my way to the parking lot exit by 5 o'clock. If I wasn't there, she would leave. I asked for her phone number or the name of our car, and she simply laughed. That same tinkling, melodic sound she used for her customers, and said that a child who couldn't navigate a simple building didn't deserve to reach the destination. I stood there for 3 hours, the $5 bill damp with sweat in my palm. Every adult face was a blur of strangers who could not see the invisible tether being severed. I remember the tactile coldness of the plastic benches and the way the mall music seemed to mock my rising panic. I didn't cry. I knew crying was an invitation for an extension of the lesson. When I finally reached the exit, my legs shaking and my chest tight with a terror I couldn't name, I found her sitting in the car, reading a magazine. She didn't ask if I was okay. She looked at her watch and noted that I was 4 minutes late, which would be deducted from my dinner. That was the reality of my upbringing. Every mistake was a debt. Every fear was a data point. The lessons only escalated as I grew older. By 12, I was expected to manage a ledger of my own, overhead. Eleanor would sit at the kitchen table, the light from the pendant lamp casting long, skeletal shadows across the linoleum, and itemized the cost of my existence. The price of the milk I drank, the electricity used for my desk lamp, the wear and tear on my school shoes. She told me she was preparing me for the transactional nature of the universe. She would say, "Julian, the world is a balance sheet, and you are currently in the red." She backdated these entries with a forensic precision that would have been admirable if it weren't so deeply psychotic. My father was a ghost in this process, a man who had long ago traded his spine for the quiet life of an acquiescent observer. He would nod from the corner, his eyes fixed on the newspaper, while my mother explained that my birthday gift, a set of colored pencils, would be added to my total liability because art is a luxury for those who have already earned their keep. This contrast framing was her masterpiece. On Sundays, we would walk to the local Episcopal church, Eleanor dressed in tailored wool, nodding gracefully to the rector, the very image of a devoted, middle-class mother. She would lean in and whisper to the other mothers about how I was such a focused boy, omitting the fact that my focus was born of hypervigilance. She would talk about character building while I stood beside her, feeling the bruises on my psyche that no one could see. The town loved her for her discipline. They saw a woman raising a productive member of society, unaware that she was actually raising an insurgent who was learning to count every penny she cost him. I learned to disappear within the house. I learned the precise acoustics of the floorboards, which ones creaked and which ones remained silent. I learned to draw in the margins of my notebooks, creating complex blueprints of houses with doors that only I could lock. These were the only spaces where I had agency. I spent my teenage years in a state of constant, quiet calculation. While other boys were playing sports or experimenting with rebellion, I was studying the way Eleanor managed her boutique's finances. I watched her negotiate with suppliers, the way she used silence as a weapon to force a lower price. I watched her manipulate the town council into zoning changes that benefited her shop. I realized then that cruelty wasn't just an impulse for her. It was a strategy. It was a language of power that she used to ensure she was always the one holding the master lease on every relationship in her life. The psychological weight of this environment created a unique kind of callousing. I didn't hate her then. I studied her. I treated her as a competitor in a long-term game of endurance. When she would sell my old toys at a garage sale and keep the money to offset my clothing allowance, I didn't argue. I simply started finding ways to make my own money, mowing lawns and delivering papers, keeping my earnings in a literal hole I dug beneath a loose board in the back of my closet. I knew that if she found my capital, she would claim it as her own for management fees. This was my first foray into offshore banking, a primitive but effective way to hide my assets from a hostile entity. The scent of lavender in her shop became a trigger for me, a smell that signaled the beginning of a performance I was forced to participate in. I would stand in that boutique after school, helping her fold linens into perfect stacks, watching her charm the very people who would eventually ignore my disappearance. She was a pillar of Willow Creek, a woman of substance, a woman of taste, and I was the secret liability she was determined to liquidate. She would often tell me, with that fixed, painted smile, that she was doing me a favor by not loving me in the way common mothers loved their children. She said that affection was a form of inflation. It made a person believe they were worth more than their utility. As I approached my 18th year, the atmosphere in the house shifted from a project to a conclusion. Eleanor stopped talking about my future and started talking about my final bill. She began to leave brochures for local shelters on the kitchen island, not as a threat, but as a suggestion of my probable trajectory. She wanted me to know that her investment in me was reaching its maturity date, and she had no intention of renewing the contract. She would sit in her mahogany chair, the light reflecting off her pearls, and talk about how she looked forward to the purity of a house without the clutter of a dependent. My existence was clutter. My needs were an inefficiency. And as the date of my 18th birthday loomed, the heavy oak door seemed to grow more imposing, a looming barrier that was preparing to swing outward and stay that way. The public mask was as bright as ever, her charity work reaching a pitch as she prepared for the gala. But inside the house, the furnace seemed to provide no warmth. We were living in a cold vault, waiting for the clock to strike midnight on the final day of my childhood. It was in this environment that I learned the most important lesson. In a world of predators, the only thing that matters is who holds the title to the land. The ledger was a black, cloth-bound book she kept in the top drawer of the sideboard, right next to the silver polish. It was a sacred object, more influential than any religious text. On nights when the wind would howl across the flat Illinois plains, rattling the window panes in my room, I could hear the rhythmic scratching of her fountain pen against the heavy paper. It was the sound of my life being quantified. She would record the cost of the flu medication I required in the winter of 1996, adjusted for the time she spent administering it. She would calculate the depreciation of the carpet in my room. Everything had a price. Everything was a transaction. This book was her evidence that I was a drain on her resources, a narrative she reinforced every single day at the table. She would look at me over her glass of chilled white wine and say, "Julian, do you know how many square feet of retail space your bedroom represents? You are an opportunity cost I am forced to endure." This constant bombardment of financial dehumanization didn't break me. It gave me a blueprint. I began to see people as a collection of assets and liabilities. I began to understand that the respectable persona she maintained in Willow Creek was a form of equity she traded for social power. She was the woman who brought home-baked bread to the sick, yet she was also the woman who charged her own son interest on a pair of winter boots. This duality was the forge in which I was shaped. I learned that the public-facing version of a person is often a meticulously constructed lie, designed to distract from the brutal mechanics of their true nature. I saw it in the way she handled the shopgirls at the linens boutique. She would praise them in front of customers, then deduct the cost of a broken coat hanger from their meager paychecks the moment the door was locked. She was a master of the small-scale squeeze, the incremental extraction of value from those beneath her. By the time I was 17, I was no longer a child. I was a tenant awaiting eviction. I moved through the house with a ghost-like efficiency, taking up as little physical and emotional space as possible. I would sit in the library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and wood wax, and read books on property law and contract theory. I wanted to understand the rules of the game she was playing. I wanted to know the exact legal definitions of abandonment and duty of care, even though I knew the town would always take her side. In Willow Creek, Eleanor Vance was the law. Her lessons were seen as a rigorous, commendable form of parenting that other, weaker mothers should emulate. I remember a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, stopping me on the sidewalk and saying, "You're so lucky to have a mother who cares about your future enough to be firm, Julian." I simply nodded and kept walking, the ledger in the sideboard burning a hole in my mind. The final year was a masterpiece of tension. Eleanor began to treat me with a polite, distant formality, as if I were a houseguest whose stay had gone on far too long. She would leave invoices for my share of the groceries on my pillow. She would ask me, with that sharp, tinkling laugh, what my exit strategy was. She was treating my 18th birthday like a corporate merger, or rather, a corporate divestiture. She was ready to shed the liability and return to her curated life of linens and garden clubs. And as the frost began to settle on the grass of our neatly manicured lawn, the air in the house grew thin. The sensory experience of my childhood was reaching its conclusion. The smell of lavender in the boutique, the smell of mahogany polish in the library, and the absolute, terrifying silence of a mother who viewed her son as nothing more than a bad investment. I was 18 years old, standing on the precipice of a world she had made intentionally hard, waiting for the final click of the deadbolt that would signify my liberation and my exile. The stage was set for the birthday I would never forget. The Vance pedagogy was about to reach its final, brutal exam, and Eleanor was already holding the red pen, ready to fail me before I even stepped out the door. She thought she was winning. She thought she was finally closing the book on Julian Vance. But she didn't realize that I had spent 18 years learning her language, and I was about to go out into the world and become the most fluent speaker she had ever met. The reality of my departure wasn't a loss of a home. It was the start of a 10-year acquisition strategy that would lead me right back to her doorstep. I looked at the heavy oak door one last time, knowing that the next time I saw it, I wouldn't be the one being asked to leave. I would be the one holding the keys. I was ready. I am Julian Vance. Section 3. The Breaking Point / The Betrayal. The morning of my 18th birthday arrived with a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight against my chest. In a normal household, 18 is a milestone celebrated with a cake, a sense of transition, or perhaps a conversation about the future. In the Vance household, it was the day the experiment concluded. I walked down the stairs at exactly 7 in the morning, the habitual timing of my childhood still governing my movements. The house smelled of nothing. No breakfast was cooking. No lavender from the atrium was wafting through the vents. The air was sterile and cold. My mother was standing at the granite kitchen island, her posture as straight and unyielding as a structural column. She was wearing her charcoal wool suit, her public mask of professional excellence already perfectly in place. On the counter sat 2 items. My old blue soccer duffel bag, bulging with whatever she had deemed worth keeping from my room, and a single heavy manila envelope. She didn't wish me a happy birthday. She didn't look at me with the eyes of a parent. She looked at me with the eyes of an auditor closing out a legacy account. She tapped the manila envelope with a manicured fingernail. "Inside this, Julian, you will find the final statement of your overhead," she said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the fluted melody she used for her customers. This was the voice of a liquidator. I opened the envelope and felt my reality fracture. It was a 22-page document, meticulously formatted on professional letterhead. She called it the audit of upbringing. It was an itemized list of every expense she had incurred on my behalf since the day I was born. There were line items for the prorated cost of milk, the electricity used by my desk lamp, and a $12 charge from 2007 for a window I had accidentally broken with a tennis ball. She had even factored in a 5% annual interest rate for the cost of my private school tuition. The bottom line was a figure that felt like a death sentence: $214,000. "The real world is a cold creditor, Julian," she said, sliding the blue bag toward me. "I have spent 18 years providing you with the capital and the training necessary to survive. Today, the investment period terminates. I am calling in the debt of your presence." She was smiling now, that sharp, satisfied smirk that always followed a successful lesson. She told me that she had checked the bus schedules and that there was a Greyhound leaving for Chicago in 90 minutes. She handed me my birth certificate and my Social Security card as if she were handing over a deed to a property that had gone into foreclosure. "You have exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises before I report an intruder to the local police," she informed me. She wasn't angry. She was exhilarated. This was her masterpiece, the ultimate lesson in the absolute transactional nature of human existence. I took the bag and the envelope. I didn't say a word. I had learned long ago that to speak was to provide her with more data for her experiments. I walked toward the entryway, my socks sliding against the polished hardwood I had spent hundreds of hours buffing to her satisfaction. I stepped onto the welcome mat and looked back at her one last time. She was standing in the kitchen, already opening a folder of linens for her boutique, effectively erasing me from her internal ledger before I had even cleared the threshold. I stepped out onto the porch. The Illinois sky was a bruised purple, and a fine, cold rain was beginning to fall, turning the world into a landscape of gray and black. I heard the heavy oak door swing shut behind me. Then came the sound that would define the next decade of my life. The heavy, mechanical thud of the deadbolt sliding home. It was the sound of a total, irreversible forfeiture. I stood there for a moment, staring at the frosted glass of the sidelight. My mother's silhouette was clearly visible on the other side. She didn't walk away. She stood there watching me through the textured glass, and then I heard it. Her high-pitched, crystalline laugh echoed through the wood, muffled but unmistakably triumphant. She was laughing because she had won. She was laughing because she had successfully cast her only child into the void to prove a point about resilience. She had bet my life on her ideology. I turned away and began the walk to the station. The rain was steady now, soaking through my thin jacket and turning the blue fabric of the duffel bag dark. The asphalt of the road was slick and unforgiving, its gritty texture vibrating through the soles of my shoes with every step. The 2-mile walk to the bus station was a transformation. With every block I traveled, the boy who had spent 18 years trying to earn a place at that kitchen table began to dissolve. The grit of the wet road felt like it was wearing away the last of my softness. I looked at the houses we passed, the respectable, middle-class homes with their warm lights and manicured lawns, and I realized they were all theaters. Behind every door was a contract, and I had just been evicted from mine. I reached the station, my hands numb and my duffel bag weighing 100 pounds, and I sat on a metal bench that was bolted to the concrete floor. I looked at the audit of upbringing one last time before dropping it into a trash can. She wanted to teach me about the cold reality of the market. She wanted to prove that the world was a series of distressed assets and calculated risks. As I watched the bus pull into the terminal, its air brakes hissing with a sound that mimicked the deadbolt at home, I made a silent vow. I accepted her premise. I would become the monster she had tried to build, but I would do it better than she ever could. If life was a game of leverage, I would acquire all of it. I would never return to that house as a son. I would never ask for a family discount. I would move through the world with the same clinical, predatory focus she had used to break me. I would build a life so structurally sound and technically dominant that her entire reality would eventually look like a rounding error on my balance sheet. I stepped onto the bus, the smell of diesel and damp wool surrounding me, and I didn't look back at the town of Oak Knoll. I was done with lessons. I was ready to begin the long, silent work of the acquisition. The woman behind the frosted glass thought she had seen the last of me. She thought her laugh was the final word. She was wrong. She had spent 18 years teaching me how to be a landlord. I was simply going to wait for the market to turn. I was ready to become the landlord of my own fate. Section 4. The strategy of silence, the technical layer. Chicago in early winter is a brutal geometry of steel and freezing wind, a place that rewards only the most rigid structures. When I arrived, I did not seek a home. I sought a vantage point. I took a job as a junior analyst for a property management firm that specialized in the unglamorous plumbing of debt. While other 20-year-olds were focused on social capital, I was focused on the internal rate of return. I spent my days inside a cramped cubicle that smelled of stale coffee and the heavy, metallic dust of old blueprints. I learned that real estate is not a business of bricks and mortar. It is a business of paper and leverage. My mother had tried to use the audit of upbringing as a psychological weapon, but I realized it was merely a poorly structured liability. I began to study the mechanics of distressed assets with a predatory intensity. I learned how to identify the cracks in a balance sheet before the owner even knew they were failing. My education was clinical, fueled by the rhythmic, percussive clacking of a mechanical keyboard that echoed through my empty apartment long into the night. I became a ghost in the world of acquisitions, a silent operator who understood that anonymity is the ultimate strategic advantage in a hostile market. By the time I turned 25, I had moved from analyst to associate. I had also started my own shell corporation, a Series LLC I named Vesper Holdings. I did not want the Vance name anywhere near my transactions. I wanted to be a shadow. I lived for the 3 o'clock hour, the time when the city is silent and the only thing visible is the cold, blue light of a spreadsheet reflecting off my glasses. My eyes would burn, but the math was beautiful. It was objective. It was a language my mother could not speak, but one she would eventually be forced to respect. I started small, acquiring tax liens and non-performing notes in the suburbs. I was building a machine, a multi-layered legal architecture designed to absorb value without leaving a fingerprint. I understood the power of the 1031 exchange and the tax efficiency of the master lease. I was not just buying property. I was buying the future leverage of everyone who lived within those walls. The hunt for Oak Knoll began in my 7th year of exile. I started with a forensic accounting trace of the atrium's public filings. My mother was a brilliant performer, but a mediocre accountant. She relied on the respectability of her boutique to secure bridge loans she could not actually service. I watched the quarterly reports like a hawk, identifying the moment her debt service coverage ratio dropped below a dangerous threshold. She was overleveraged, using the equity in her residential block to fund the failing French linen displays of her public life. I waited. Real estate is a game of patience, a slow-motion audit of a person's life choices. I eventually located the primary mortgage note for the entire commercial and residential strip where her boutique and apartment were situated. The bank was looking to offload the risk. I moved with a clinical, technical precision that she had never taught me but had accidentally engineered. Through a complex network of pass-through entities and an anonymous irrevocable trust, I bought the debt. I did not buy the house. I bought the right to dictate its existence. I became the master lessor, the person who holds the ultimate legal authority over the title. I hired a third-party property management firm, a high-density operation out of St. Louis, to handle the daily interactions. I instructed them to be unyielding. No grace periods, no exceptions, no personal conversations. I wanted the management to be as cold and mechanical as the deadbolt she had slid home 10 years ago. I spent nights reviewing the digital ledger of her payments, watching her struggle to meet the escalating common area maintenance charges and the triple net lease obligations. The smell of those blueprints, the ink-heavy and acrid scent of the physical documents, reminded me of the weight of that oak door. The clacking of my keyboard was the sound of the locks turning in reverse. The technical complexity of the acquisition was my sanctuary. I structured the trust so that even a title search would only reveal a generic corporate trustee. I was a beneficiary shielded by 5 layers of legal insulation. I was the silent operator of her daily life, the ghost who decided whether her heat stayed on or if her boutique's windows were repaired. I was implementing the very lesson she had forced upon me, that nobody owes you anything and that survival is a calculation. I spent hours at my desk. The blue light of the Excel rose illuminating a map of her financial collapse. I knew her net worth to the penny. I knew the exact date her boutique's inventory became a net liability. I was not acting out of anger. I was acting out of a deep structural necessity. I was conducting a 10-year audit of a 22-page bill. The transition from student to master was complete when the master lease was finally executed. I held the keys to the kingdom she had used to humiliate me. I watched her missed calls increase as the delinquency notices were served by my representatives. She was calling the son she had discarded, hoping for the very sentimentality she had branded as a weakness. But I was not a son anymore. I was a senior acquisition strategist. I was the personification of the cold market she had praised. I sat in my office, the air filtration hummed the only sound, and I felt the tactile coldness of the glass desk against my palms. I was ready. The forensic audit of my childhood was over, and the findings were conclusive. She was in default, not just on her rent, but on the very ideology she had used to define my life. I had built an empire of silence, and now I was ready to speak. The management firm sent over the final eviction package for my signature. The paperwork was crisp, the black ink bold against the white bond paper. I signed it with a steady hand, my signature a clinical mark of authority. I was not just signing a notice to quit. I was signing the conclusion of a decade-long experiment. I thought about the smell of the lavender sachets in her boutique and the way they masked the rot of her finances. I thought about the sound of her high-pitched, customer service laugh and how it would sound when she finally saw me standing on her doorstep. The technical validation of my success was the only apology I required. I had used her own tools to dismantle her world, and I had done it without ever raising my voice or showing my hand. I was the ultimate graduate of the Vance resilience training. I prepared for the trip back to Oak Knoll with the same professional detachment I used for a high-stakes closing. I packed a single bag, one that was far more expensive than the blue duffel bag she had handed me on my 18th birthday. I checked the weather. Cold, gray, and rainy. Perfect. I wanted the atmospheric conditions to match the memory of my departure. I reviewed the chain of title one last time, ensuring every LLC, every trust, and every indemnification clause was perfectly aligned. I was a man of the law now, a man of contracts and specific performance. I was moving back into her reality not to reclaim a home, but to execute a judgment. The strategy of silence had reached its natural end. The next phase was the unmasking, the moment when the phantom landlord finally took a human shape. I looked at the 29 missed calls on my phone and felt a quiet, focused clarity. She was desperate. She was facing the very gutter she had predicted for me. I wondered if she would find it educational. I wondered if she would appreciate the grit and character required to survive a winter on the streets of Illinois. Probably not. Cruel people rarely enjoy the taste of their own medicine. But that was irrelevant. The market does not care about feelings. It only cares about the terms of the lease. I stood up from my desk, the blue light of the spreadsheet finally extinguished. I walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline, the steel and glass a mirror of my own internal architecture. I was leaving the 40-floor sanctuary of my office to go back to the welcome mat of a dark cherry oak door. I was going back to Oak Knoll to deliver the final statement. The audit is complete. The debt is due. And as she so clearly taught me, the real world has no room for those who cannot pay their overhead. I am no longer the subject of the lesson. I am the one who grades the exam. And Eleanor Vance is about to realize that she has failed her own course. The heavy mechanical sound of the deadbolt is about to be replaced by the quiet, permanent snap of a briefcase closing. I am coming home, and for the first time, I am the one with the keys. Section 5, the public unmasking/climax. I drove into Oak Knoll as the sun was surrendering to a slate-gray sky. The town was exactly as I had left it, a collection of curated lawns and polite deceptions that masked the rot of small-town secrets. I turned onto my childhood street, the tires of my car humming against the wet pavement with a low, rhythmic drone. I parked at the curb, directly in front of the dark cherry oak door. The house looked smaller now, as if my own success and the vastness of the city had physically shrunk the scale of her kingdom. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold rain misting against my wool suit and dampening the leather of my briefcase. I felt a strange, clinical detachment. I was not here for a reunion or a reconciliation. I was here to close a file that had been open for 3,650 days. I walked up the driveway, the gritty texture of the concrete familiar under my shoes, reminding me of the night I had walked this same path with a bag of wet clothes. I reached the porch and looked at the brass deadbolt. It was polished to a high shine, a golden eye watching the world. I reached out and pressed the doorbell. It was not the soft, melodic chime of my youth. I had instructed the property management firm to install a heavy, industrial ringer during the security upgrade I ordered last month. The sound was a deep, resonating boom that vibrated through the wood of the door and into the very soles of my feet. It was the sound of a formal summons, a mechanical declaration that the silent operator had finally arrived at the gate to reclaim the territory she once owned. I heard footsteps. They were not the rhythmic, military clicks of her high heels that used to strike fear into the floorboards. They were soft, shuffling, and uneven, the gait of a person who had lost their momentum. The lock turned, that familiar, heavy mechanical thud, and the door swung open. Eleanor Vance stood in the threshold, and for a moment, the world felt like it had tilted on its axis. The public mask of the atrium was in total ruins. Her hair, once a perfect, silver-sculpted tribute to grace, was thin, gray, and unstyled. But it was her feet that anchored the reality of her collapse. She was wearing worn, mismatched slippers, one of faded pink wool with a loose thread, the other a tattered gray fleece that was missing its lining. They were the footwear of someone who had lost the energy to maintain a facade. She looked at me, her eyes squinting against the dim porch light, searching my face for a reason. She did not recognize me. Not at first. To her, I was just a man in a $3,000 suit, an anonymous representative of the shadow corporation that held her life in a manila folder. She instantly tried to shift into her charming lady persona, the corners of her mouth twitching upward into a practiced, desperate smile that didn't reach her eyes. She smelled faintly of sour milk and stale lavender, the tragic scent of a boutique that had been dead for a long time. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, her voice thin and wavering like a dying light. "I was hoping the management office would finally send someone I could actually talk to. Please come in. It is so dreadfully cold out there. I have been waiting for you." I did not move. I remained on the welcome mat, keeping a precise legal distance from the interior of the unit. She began her pitch, launching into the same practiced manipulation she had used to secure bridge loans from unsuspecting neighbors for years. She spoke about her decades of service to the Oak Knoll community, the vital importance of Eleanor's atrium to the local economy, and the temporary cash flow irregularities caused by a changing market. She actually used the word compassion. She looked me in the eye and said that a responsible community only thrives when the powerful show mercy to the vulnerable. She argued that a small extension on her rent was not just a favor, but a moral investment in the town's character. She was performing the very sentimentality she had branded as a fatal weakness in me 10 years ago. She reached out to touch my sleeve, her hand shaking with a tremor she couldn't hide. "You understand, don't you?" she asked, her voice hushed. "We all have to look out for one another. It is the lesson my parents taught me. Character is built through support, not just through the struggle." I stared at her, the blue light of the neighborhood street lamp reflecting off my glasses and masking my expression. I watched the way her mismatched slippers shifted on the hardwood, the pink wool rubbing against the gray fleece. She was a distressed asset pleading for a stay of execution from a market that had no memory. I let the silence stretch until her desperate smile began to fracture. She stood there looking at me as if I were her last hope in this cruel world that she had once praised so highly before she lost everything to the debt collector at the door now. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the heavy manila envelope. The paper made a sharp, crisp rustle, a sound so loud it seemed to cut through the low hiss of the falling rain. I looked at her, and for the first time, I let the professional mask slip just enough for her to see the boy she had left on the yellow plastic bench. "Hello, Eleanor," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any heat, and perfectly steady. Her hand dropped from my sleeve as if it had been burned. Her eyes widened, the pupils dilating in a sudden, sharp shock of recognition. The practiced smile vanished instantly, leaving her face slack, hollow, and incredibly old. "Julian?" she whispered. Her voice broke on the second syllable, a jagged sound in the quiet entryway. She took a half step back, her mismatched slippers scuffing against the polished hardwood I used to buff. "My name is Julian Vance," I said, maintaining my clinical tone. "But for the purposes of this interaction, I am the authorized representative of Vesper Holdings LLC and the primary beneficiary of the irrevocable trust that holds the master lease for this property. I am your landlord, Eleanor." She stared at me, her mouth hanging open, the silence of the house rushing out to meet us. She tried to reach for the mother mask now, her eyes filling with tears that were as transactional as her boutique's invoices. "Julian, oh my God, I have been calling you for weeks. Things have been so hard since your father passed. I did not know it was you. If I had known it was my own son, I never would have been so formal about any of this mess between us right now on this rainy evening. Please help me." I opened the folder and began to read from the top sheet. I was not speaking to a parent. I was auditing a delinquent account. "I am here regarding the 3-month arrears on both this residential unit and the commercial storefront downtown," I said. "You are in material breach of the master lease agreement executed on June 12th. Specifically, I am invoking Clause 14, Section B, regarding the total default in the payment of monthly rent. Your cure period expired 48 hours ago at 5 p.m. She tried to interrupt, to speak of family and the holidays in the past, but I continued with a clinical, focused intensity that allowed no room for her drama. "Furthermore," I said, "our forensic audit of the commercial space has identified a severe breach of Clause 9 regarding unauthorized structural alterations to the load-bearing walls, and a breach of Clause 22 regarding your total failure to maintain appropriate liability insurance levels. You have devalued the asset, Eleanor. You have treated this property with the exact same lack of structural integrity that you once accused me of having." She began to cry then. Not the loud, manipulative sob of her resilience lessons, but a quiet, terrified whimpering that sounded like a wounded animal. I am your mother, Julian. You cannot do this to me. Where would I go? Who would take in a woman of my age? I looked at her, my reflection clear in the dark glass of the entryway. You told me once that the world is a cold creditor, I said. I am simply closing the account. You should have remembered your own rules before you violated every single term in this legal document I am holding right in front of your aging face during this very difficult and final audit of our lives. I leaned in slightly, the sharp scent of my espresso meeting the stale, sour lavender of her presence. The real world is a cold place, Eleanor, I said, mirroring the exact tone she had used on my 18th birthday. A man is only as strong as his ability to navigate the unknown. I am simply providing you with the capital and the training necessary to survive this transition. This is a vital lesson in the transient nature of capital. I am calling in the long overdue debt of your presence. She gasped, the memory of her own cruel words hitting her like a physical blow. You are being heartless, she whispered. No, I replied, I am being a landlord. In a real market, there is no such thing as a family discount. You taught me that the world is nothing more than a series of distressed assets and calculated risks. I simply accepted your premise and built my life upon it. I held out the eviction documents. The paper felt heavy in my hand, a physical manifestation of a 10-year audit finally coming to its conclusion. According to the court order, you have 72 hours to vacate this unit. I have authorized the management firm to oversee the removal of all personal property. I have already contacted a liquidation company to handle the remaining boutique inventory to satisfy the commercial debt. Truth catches up, Eleanor. Even in small towns. I tucked the envelope into her shaking hands, turned, and walked back into the rain. I did not look back. I had delivered the final statement. You should find your own way home now, just as you once suggested I do when I had nothing but a bag of wet clothes and a very broken heart at 18 on that cold birthday night. Section 6. The Aftermath and Final Moral. The 72 hours passed with the mechanical inevitability of a court-mandated deadline. I did not return to the dark cherry oak door to supervise the physical removal of her belongings. Instead, I watched the progress through the digital feed of the Ring cameras I had installed during the acquisition. I sat in my office in Chicago, the clinical hum of the air filtration system providing the only soundtrack to her departure. I watched as the professional movers, whom I had instructed to be efficient and entirely silent, carried out the remnants of her curated life. I saw the French linens from the atrium, now dusty and yellowed, being tossed into the back of a truck. I saw the heavy oak furniture that once made me feel small being wrapped in plastic and hauled away. Finally, I saw her. Eleanor Vance walked toward the transport van with a gait that had lost all of its military precision. She was no longer wearing the mismatched slippers. I had anonymously authorized the social worker to provide her with a pair of sturdy, inexpensive sneakers. She looked diminished, a frail silhouette against the backdrop of a house that no longer recognized her name. She was moved to a 400-square-foot studio apartment on the industrial edge of Oak Knoll. I own that building through a tertiary shell company. It is a clean, functional space, but it is entirely devoid of the theater she loved. There are no lavender sachets. There are no high ceilings. There is only a single bed, a small table, and a kitchen that smells perpetually of industrial disinfectant and the cold reality of a fixed income. Her new lease is a masterpiece of technical constraint. It is a month-to-month agreement, contingent upon her absolute adherence to the very rules she once used to bind my spirit. No late payments are tolerated. No unauthorized guests are permitted. No structural changes are allowed. I have effectively provided her with the resilience training she claimed to value, but I have removed the safety net of her public status. She is now a tenant in a world governed by the same cold, transactional logic she used to justify throwing her 18-year-old son into the rain. I sat in my car outside her new building on the evening she arrived. The silence of the suburban street at dusk was absolute, a heavy, oppressive quiet that felt like the final period at the end of a very long sentence. I held the heavy key ring in my hand, the brass and steel cold against my palm. These keys symbolize more than just property. They symbolize total control over the architecture of my own life and the life of the person who tried to dismantle it. I felt the weight of them, a physical manifestation of the leverage I had spent a decade acquiring. I looked up at the third-floor window where a single dim light flickered to life. I knew she was in there, sitting on that small bed, perhaps smelling the lack of perfume and finally understanding the cost of her lessons. She used to say that character was built through the struggle, that a diamond is only formed under immense, soul-crushing pressure. She ignored the fact that the same pressure that creates a diamond also turns bone into dust and hearts into stone. She wanted the result of the training without ever having to pay the overhead of the damage she caused. In my office, I have a collection of forensic manuals that describe how to measure the load-bearing capacity of a foundation. Her foundation was built on the shifting sands of her own ego and the perceived respectability of a small-town boutique. My foundation is built on the rigid, objective facts of the legal code. There is a specific performance required for a life well lived, and it does not involve the public humiliation of those who depend on you. I have seen the way her eyes changed when she read the new lease agreement. She saw the clinical precision of the language. She saw the ghost of her own distorted logic return to her in the form of a binding contract. Every word in that document is a reminder that she is no longer the author of the narrative. She is merely a resident in a world I have constructed. This is the reality of the Vance audit. It is a cold ledger with no room for sentimentality or a family discount. I have provided her with a roof and a bed, which is a far more generous settlement than she offered me on my 18th birthday. I have balanced the account. But as I sit here in the absolute silence of this Illinois evening, I find myself wondering about the nature of the training she provided. If your parent laughed as they threw you out, would you take them back once you own the house? Or would you let the law handle it exactly the way they taught you? Let's discuss in the comments. I started the engine of my car. The interior was a sanctuary of high-end engineering, smelling of rich, new car leather, and the total absence of ghosts. I adjusted the rearview mirror, watching the silhouette of the humble apartment building fade into the darkness as I pulled away from the curb. The lesson I learned wasn't the one she intended to teach. She thought she was teaching me how to survive the world by being hard. But the world didn't need me to be a monster. It needed me to be a man who knew the difference between a contract and a family. Real family doesn't test your survival to prove your worth. Real love doesn't withhold a key to teach you the value of a door. Real love builds a shelter before the storm even arrives. It doesn't celebrate the rain. It provides the roof. I drove past the Oak Knoll city limit sign, the lights of the highway beginning to blur into a single, continuous stream of gold and white. The air in the car remained perfectly climate-controlled, a bubble of peace in a world that she tried to make hostile through her experiments. I am 40 floors above her now, even when I am at sea level. I have achieved the ultimate form of resilience, the ability to walk away and never look back at the ruins. The past is a distressed asset that I have finally liquidated. I no longer feel the need to check the missed calls. I have instructed my property management firm to block my personal number from their contact list. If there is a maintenance emergency, they will handle it. If there is a violation of the lease, they will execute the eviction. There is no longer a Julian Vance for her to manipulate. There is only a senior strategist who understands the value of a clean exit. The audit is closed. The debt is satisfied. The silent operator is finally going home to a house that is truly and legally his. Real healing begins the moment you stop calling cruelty a lesson and start calling it what it was. And once you do that, you can build a life so steady that even the people who broke you cannot take it back. I am driving into the future, and for the first time, the rearview mirror is empty.